my name is Faruk, and I hate JavaScript. Wait, which conference is this? Oh, right. Yeah. So, actually, I'm not entirely kidding. I really don't like JavaScript, and I've been doing cross-browser compatible web development for about 10 years. Most of that time, I've had to deal with CSS issues between the browsers, which, if you've been around long enough in this industry, you know that basically translates into I've had to deal with CSS since Internet Explorer has supported CSS. And I'm saying this so that you'll fully appreciate the significance when I say CSS support across the browsers over the past 10 years has been a bit of a mess. Understatement of the century. And so what does that have to do with JavaScript? Well, me hating JavaScript in particular. It's the same thing where it's all the JavaScript incompatibilities between the browsers that I really don't like. And that's not so much JavaScript as it is the DOM, perhaps, but nonetheless, in general, I just don't like JavaScript, don't like writing it. And oops. So, oops. So I've been doing this CSS thing mostly for 10 years, and you know, it's pretty bad when the guy doing CSS is complaining about JavaScript. You know your situation is pretty bad when, I mean, I feel sorry for you guys having to deal with all that JavaScript stuff on a daily basis. But, I don't know. So this kind of brings to light two little questions. I mean, if I hate JavaScript, who am I and why am I talking at a conference? So let's start with the first question, who am I? But before I go on to that, just a quick, I want to briefly point out that at this conference, I'm only the third speaker so far to hate on JavaScript, so I'm not even the first, which says something, I think. Anyway, so who am I? Well, aside from evidently being a Route 66 traveler, I do things like design, web-centered evangelism, accessibility, photography, and you'll notice that programming isn't really on that list. Now, I've done a lot of programming in my life, actually, but the vast majority of that has been PHP, Postgres, Python. In other words, mostly backend and database programming. So the funny thing is, the very little JavaScript that I've actually done in my career has somehow given me this reputation of also being a JavaScript guy. Small reputation, but still. And I don't really, I have no qualms being lobbed together with JavaScript guys and girls. It's, you know, you're all good people. But I think it's not entirely fitting, and I don't think it's entirely fair to all the very talented JavaScript people here in the audience who I can pretty much guarantee know more about JavaScript than I do. Which brings us to question number 2, why am I here? What path have I traveled that leads me to me, Mr. I Hate JavaScript, to speak here at a JavaScript conference in Berlin? Well, the first stint that got me this curiously placed reputation as being a JavaScript guy came with FACE, an acronym that stands for Faruk's Animated CSS Enhancements. Clearly a very inspired name. FACE was a little toolkit that I released in 2005, which it allows you to do stop motion animation using nothing but CSS. It is a little JavaScript toolkit, but in using it, all you have to do is write CSS classes, and they would be steps like frames in an animation. The JavaScript would then figure out what you were trying to do, and it would animate through those classes, and you have your animation. All you had to do is write it in CSS. And somehow, because it's a JavaScript toolkit, this started that little reputation of being a JavaScript guy. But I find it kind of ironic because if you really look at FACE, I mean, the whole toolkit is about not writing JavaScript, but writing CSS. So clearly, people could have figured out that I don't like JavaScript back then. Face eventually led me to a job at a certain fruit company in California, where I worked for a couple of years. Fruit company which will remain nameless. And after a couple of years of working there, I left this summer. And very shortly after leaving, I released the second piece of JavaScript that got me this recognition, and that is Moderniser. Moderniser is a JavaScript toolkit that makes it easier to use HTML5 and CSS3 in your websites today. And we'll go into that more in a moment. First, I want to talk about what Face and Moderniser have in common. Besides being the combined reason that I'm standing here talking about JavaScript at a JavaScript conference. I mean, why am I telling you all of this? Is this just to further inflate my oversized ego? No, I actually have a point here. There are three main reasons why Face and Moderniser got the recognition that they did. Now, Face has basically been made completely obsolete with the arrival of proper JavaScript-driven animation engines, one of which you'll undoubtedly already know and probably use as it's part of jQuery. I mean, who here does not use jQuery? What's wrong with you people? I mean, John Resig, is he in a room? He's like, right. Europeans from Europe. And so Face has been made obsolete by proper JavaScript animation engines, but Moderniser, well, first of all, Moderniser is only a couple months old, but it's actually, it's becoming increasingly more useful the more people learn about it and the more people start using it while building websites. And so it's becoming increasingly more valuable. So what do Face and Moderniser have in common? Now, first of all, they are both unobtrusive toolkits, which means if you use them properly and as intended, they will not break the website that you use them in. They will not break for people who might be using older browsers or who might have JavaScript disabled or filtered through proxy or something. So they're unobtrusive, which is a good thing. Second, they very strongly encourage the use of progressive enhancements. And that basically means that your website will look better and behave more interestingly the better the browser is that you're using. It really is just a way of saying, the better your browser, the richer the experience of this website will be for you. And that's a powerful thing. We'll get to that in a moment. And lastly, they are both accessible. They are very accessible little toolkits, meaning that the use of them does not impede on the web accessibility of your site. And that means it's still possible to use these toolkits and make a very inaccessible website, but if you use them as intended, as designed, then they won't have any negative effect on the web accessibility of your site, unlike certain other JavaScript toolkits and libraries out there. So another thing they have in common is that they serve to enhance your website in one way or another. Nowadays, website enhancements come in a large number of, many shapes and forms, but they're also becoming increasingly native. Now, what do I mean with native? This kind of refers back to the whole, I hate JavaScript thing. For the past couple of years, or past many years actually, JavaScript has played this really important role in augmenting older browsers with features and technologies that the newer browsers were implementing natively. They had it, and older browsers, didn't have it. So people were using JavaScript to kind of like shoehorn these new technologies and techniques into the older browsers. And it's mostly about HTML5 and CSS features, or CSS3 features in particular. Newer browsers have been adding these for the past couple of years. Other browsers, in particular mostly just Internet Explorer. They've been around for years without really adding any of these features, so people have had to rely on JavaScript to add them. And it was so that web developers could actually use these technologies, take advantage of them. But it wasn't the greatest situation. I mean, can anyone here guess how many JavaScript libraries exist to do rounded corners in Internet Explorer? Anyone? You're all so shy. Well, sorry? 45? Well, the funny thing is, no matter what number you say, the answer is wrong, because the right answer is there shouldn't be any. I mean, you can ask Dion. He was complaining yesterday about how many posts he had to write to Ajaxion about this. There shouldn't be any at all. 0. That's what it should be. So I'm going to tell you something that you probably either already agree with, or you're on the fence of this issue, or you haven't really decided yet, or you're actually against it. And it is this. A website should not look and work the exact same in every browser. It's basically the principle of similar versus the same. It's a very simple matter, actually. The first one is good. The second will make your head hurt, especially in today's browser landscape. Now, if anyone disagrees with that notion that a website should not look the same and that, in fact, it should, give it time. You'll come around eventually. Your first realization will be websites cannot look the exact same in every browser. I mean, you can make a one-page, single-image website, if you can still call that a website, and even then, the different color profiles between browsers means it won't actually be the exact same. It may behave the same because it's an image, but this is an extreme example and it's not very realistic at all. And that's the closest you'll ever be able to get to a website that is the exact same in every browser. If you have a much more realistic website with text and whatnot, you'll discover very soon that text rendering and text rendering between Mac OS X, Windows, and Linux, very different, dramatically different. Can't even possibly get it the exact same. On top of that, browsers will never implement the exact same set of features as one another. And even if they were, I mean, even between Opera on Windows and Opera on the Mac, for instance, they will never have the exact same set of bugs. So the various combinations and permutations of browsers, implementations, bugs, and features means a website just simply cannot be the exact same in every browser. And I mean, yesterday, Francisco Tomasky spoke about image sprites and how Cappuccino, their app, does horizontal sprites and vertical sprites and dynamic sprites. Now, sprites are a great way to optimize your website, but you can overdo it. For instance, jQuery.com. I mean, I'm pretty sure everyone here is at least familiar with jQuery.com and knows the website and recognizes the who's using jQuery section, where they have a bunch of logos of all these really big name companies that are using it. And that's great. And they're using a CSS image sprite to do the little hover when you go with your mouse over a logo. It becomes fully opaque instead of semi-transparent and shifts down a pixel. They're using a lot of CSS rules to accomplish that effect, and they're using a sprite that has both states of each logo in there. And that's, clearly that's not the most efficient way, but, well, yeah, it does work in Internet Explorer. But I rewrote this, just that little part, and actually I can show it briefly. And then move this over. So this is a local file, basically just jQuery.com, but with my changes. And you know, it behaves the exact same. There's a subtle fade in and out on each logo as you hover over them. It's very subtle, but you can tell the difference. It's not just an on-off switch. It's a little gradual impression, slightly richer experience. But the funny thing is, doing this, it allowed me to use about 35% less CSS to accomplish the same effect which then gave me more control and more freedom over it, because now, I mean, I can do whatever I want with these logos. I can, you know, scale them, move them around in 3D space, have them animate or whatever. And I couldn't do that with just the background position in the sprites. And it's not just that there's, you know, less CSS, more freedom, more control of the experience. It's also much less maintenance work. If you ever have to update the sprite with logos, so you add one or you delete one, or you know, you change one just to rebrand it, you don't have to make 2 copies of the logo all the time. You only have the 1 copy. The only difference is between my version and the one on jQuery.com is that by default it doesn't work in Internet Explorer. You just don't get the automatic fade and hover state. And even that hover state you could implement with a one-line CSS filter for Internet Explorer. That's probably worth it. Something more extensive, I would say, not really worth it. But yeah, this is a lot. It's more efficient, it's cleaner code, it's more powerful, and half as much maintenance, especially going forward. It'll be a lot easier. Where is my cursor? So why do clients and companies still expect that their website will be the exact same in every browser? And why do they think that makes sense? Well, because design agencies and developers don't tell them that it can't really be done, and more importantly, it shouldn't even be attempted. It's much better to focus on providing good, rich experiences and proper web accessibility than spending a lot of time using, you know, little augmentation tools and trying to get things to work the exact same or be pixel perfect. A lot of time is spent on that for very little actual gain in the experience. And I mean, there are 1,001 permutations of every single website on the entire World Wide Web out there. And your life will just be so much easier if you can convince your employers or your clients or your designers that, you know, the website will have 1,001 permutations just the same, no matter what you do. Because there's just so many in the browser landscape that you can't control. So it's better not to spend a lot of time on it. Oh yeah, so HTML5, CSS3, getting back to you know, JavaScript. There's been this trend that's been emerging with an increased availability of actual native implementations of HTML5 and CSS3 in browsers, and thereby reducing the need for and the interest in JavaScript-driven augmentation libraries and toolkits. And this is a very good thing. This trend actually is one of the main reasons I came up with the idea for Moderniser in the first place. Because, you know, browsers can do a lot of really cool stuff nowadays. And they can do it without having to rely on JavaScript, which means, you know, you can spend time on other things and being more innovative with JavaScript and being more creative with it and take advantage of these really cool features. I mean, let's look at them. Rounded corners, yes! Excitement is palpable. Font face fonts, that actually is quite exciting. Browsers are now starting to have very good, solid support for font face fonts in them natively. So you don't have to rely on Cipher and or Qfont as much anymore. Canvas, very powerful drawing. RGBA color, something I actually really like because I like transparency and nice subtle uses thereof. Border image, very powerful to do to make use of that. Box shadow, HTML5 audio and video, CSS animations, CSS transitions, 2D transformations, CSS gradients, SVG, geolocation, CSS columns, local storage, web workers, offline web apps, and so on, and so on, and so on. Now, many of these were actually mentioned by Remy yesterday, so it's very clear that a lot of really cool stuff is happening in this space. But of course, not every browser supports it yet. That's where previously, JavaScript came in, as I already mentioned, and it was used to augment these older browsers with really just approximations of the same thing. Some were quite good, some were really good. Many of them were just okay, and most of them were pretty messy and convoluted. More importantly, none of them stacked up against the actual native implementations in the browsers that do have them. So this situation kind of forced web developers to make a choice. Do I start using native implementations and ignore browsers that don't have them, or continue playing it safe with augmentation methods? Now, that's a bridge that every web developer will have to cross at one point in his or her career. For some, the chasm below is much deeper than for others, so there's no clear indication on when exactly you should cross this bridge, or how, for that matter. But in order to aid people making this choice, that's kind of where I came up with Moderniser. So let's look at that. Moderniser is one of those kind of like example situations where if I don't like the options that I have available to me in doing something, I just create another one. Kind of go out of the way and figure out what can I do instead. And I mean, I really wanted to use these native implementations of cool HTML5 and CSS3 stuff. But I also wanted to have a really easy way to accommodate the older browsers. And in other words, I wanted it to be super easy for me to use the cool stuff and have multiple levels of support in each website that I built, one for each degree of sophistication that a browser had. And so that's how I ended up with Moderniser, which what it does is it allows you to use or start using HTML5 and CSS3 today. It allows you to have full control over what your HTML, your CSS, and your JavaScript do in browsers that may not have the more advanced features yet. And that level of support is very random and very chaotically across the landscape. So, and that actually brings me to kind of the most important part of this presentation. Ta-da! Feature detection. I did not pay for that slogan. No royalty fee. Feature detection is kind of this incredibly important technique going forward, in particular in the world of HTML5 and CSS3, where this technique is far less widely used. I mean, you're all JavaScript people, you probably know this as object detection and have used this for years, where in your scripts you first detect the presence of a function or a method or a property before you start using it, so, and thus preventing errors and warnings from being thrown. Well, the same technique can be used to feature detect the availability of native implementations in browsers for HTML5 and CSS3. And it's a really powerful and very important technique. Moderniser just does pretty much that and nothing else. It does a whole bunch of feature detection, and then it tests, well, not everything, but almost everything that's currently implemented in at least one browser from HTML5 and CSS3. And then what it does, it tests whether the feature is implemented correctly, and then tells you as a web developer in the current browser, you have this feature or you do not have this feature. You have this feature and you do not have this feature. And it also creates a JavaScript object that allows you to just use that in your scripts and fork your code based on whether or not the browser has certain features implemented. So it allows you to do very clean forking of all of your code, your HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, depending on what the browser can actually do and what it can't. So this is kind of a simple example of, if you have a native implementation available, there will be a class added called font face, and you can use some cool custom font. Or if the browser doesn't have it added, you can have the no font face rule and use some fallback if you want. Or not even that. I mean, that's up to you. But the important thing is you have full control over what you do and don't do for browsers that don't have these features. And that very fine control makes it a lot easier to actually start taking advantage of all this really cool stuff. So let's look at a small demonstration of how this works, or how it can be implemented. Okay, so I have a version, my website here. Yeah, come on. All right. So this is in Safari, which I can't see. So this is in Safari. You'll just have to take my word on it, but you'll see pretty quickly that it is. And you can see here on these tabs, that's all just CSS. There's no JavaScript at all involved besides Moderniser running at the start of the page. And this is just a bunch of CSS rules saying like, hey, on hover state, I want it to be 15 pixels wider. I want to have this move out a little. I want to have the color become fully opaque, change the text color. Of course, that doesn't work quite the exact same way in other browsers. But so this is Firefox coming in now. In Firefox, Firefox doesn't do everything that Safari does and vice versa, but it does support a lot of stuff. It supports rounded corners, it supports box shadow, it supports RGBA, so you can see that. It's better in this one. It just doesn't animate. Well, if I wanted to, I could just say like, well, I don't have native implementations for CSS transitions, but hey, I can use this JavaScript library to do it anyway, so I can just animate it as I go with JavaScript. I chose not to do that. I'm fine with offering this experience to Firefox, kind of making a point, but it's very easy to add a little bit of richness with JavaScript, depending on what the browser can do here. And then let's look at Opera. Now we have Opera here. Opera, another thing you can see is that this is now only one column, whereas in Firefox and in Safari, it's two columns. That's just done in CSS. And Opera just doesn't support CSS columns, so, oh well. I didn't bother doing some JavaScript implementation for that. I mean, really? It's not that important. It's just part of blog post content. Opera doesn't do rounded corners, as you can see. Doesn't quite look the same, but you know what? It's not that bad, and I was okay with this. I kind of like that implementation. Certainly much easier to do this than creating images with rounded corners for all of these tabs in different colors, and that also wouldn't allow me to transition them in Safari. So that would have given me much less freedom, much more stuff to download as on the user side. I have to download all those images. And just for a bunch of rounded corners, not worth it. So to me, this was very much an acceptable solution to Opera, or for Opera users. I also kind of pointed out that Opera really needs to get their shit together and start implementing some of these CSS3 things, and not just make promises that yes, it's in the next build that we know, not show to people. Sorry, I kind of, I'm annoyed with Opera sometimes. No offense to all my friends at Opera, but yeah, it's disappointing. Internet Explorer, I'm not going to show it to you because, VM and all that stuff, but Internet Explorer, what I'm doing in Internet Explorer is I'm not even moving it out. I'm just letting it be a hover state in the middle. Because Internet Explorer doesn't do RGBA, so it doesn't show you that nice little subtle transparency and the see-through on the edge. So it just wouldn't look quite as nice anymore that way. Opera at least does. And with Internet Explorer, it just changes color, and that's it. Pretty simple, but good enough experience for IE users. They're not used to great stuff anyway. I mean, after all, they use IE. So it's great having all these cool HTML5 and CSS3 features available to you, but it kind of becomes this question, what do you have available and what don't you have available, and in which browsers do you have it available and in which browsers don't you have it available? Well, who here does not know this website? When can I use? Oh gosh, you shouldn't have put up your hand because now I'm going to rant at you for not knowing this website. It is a really useful website. It's something you really need to know. You need to bookmark this, make it your startup page for your browser. Go there for a week, explore it, It's a really good website. It has this incredibly detailed list, this massive overview of every single feature out of HTML5 and CSS3, cross-reference to every browser that has some semblance of support for it, and any browser that is currently publicly available that makes sense to include. And it allows you to see exactly, what's currently implemented, where is the next browser for this particular browser coming, and is it going to have an implementation for this feature or is it not? It's a really fantastic website, and you all should go there as soon as this presentation is over. So let's talk about some things not to do. Well, you don't want to dress up as a stormtrooper in 30-degree weather, stand out in the sun all day, and certainly not as a second, not an original trilogy stormtrooper. I mean, that's just disgraceful. Also very important, though, you don't want to do user agent sniffing, and you really don't want to use user agent sniffing, but I really don't want you to be doing any user agent sniffing, because UA sniffing is a really bad practice, and it's very unreliable. It breaks usability for a lot of people who have done nothing wrong except just try and use your website. And it is the main reason we have this really ridiculous Internet Explorer mess right now. Douglas Crockford mentioned yesterday that Microsoft, they couldn't really fix a lot of the issues in IE for IE8. Not entirely true. There was a way for them to do that, but of course they wouldn't because they wouldn't have control anymore. But yeah, user agent sniffing is the main reason that we currently have this absolutely dreadful, intolerable mess with Internet Explorer in the world. And I really want everyone to stop doing that. So if you do that, if you're still using that technique, please stop. Get it out of all the scripts that you have, filter it out, replace it, do object detection, do feature detection instead, and get rid of those things. It's very unreliable, it kind of breaks the web. It's really bad. And I was originally going to show, so don't do it, just don't do that. So I was originally going to show a big table here that would kind of highlight and explain this mess of Internet Explorer with IE8, the rendering engines in IE8, how the browser will identify itself depending on what kind of markup you were using, what kind of HTTP headers you were sending out, what kind of domain you were on, whether your domain was blacklisted by Microsoft or not. And that table became so big that I couldn't fit it in the slide anymore at any kind of reasonable font size. So instead, yeah, it was really, really messy, really big. Instead, I summed it up in a quote. You can have the IE8 rendering engine in a browser identifying as IE7, and vice versa. Yeah, think about that. If that doesn't sound frustrating to you, imagine that adding to that complexity, IE9 doing the same thing, and thus offering IE8, IE9, and IE7 as rendering engines in browsers identifying possibly as IE7, IE8, or IE9, and all other possible combinations thereof. Don't do browser sniffing, please. It's so bad. Build your code base off of feature detection and object detection, and sell the idea to your employers or your clients that websites just should not look and act the exact same across every browser, because that's kind of the source of it all. So don't just do this because I say so. I mean, it's great if you listen to me, but no, do this because of these real-world benefits. You'll have a shorter development time, you'll have much cleaner and clearer code, you'll have much lower maintenance overhead as you go, as time passes and you have the website and other people may need to get on board and start working with it. Your maintenance will go way below or way down, and all that kind of translates to lower costs. And for one, because time is money. And so these are very important real-world benefits that you get from not doing UA sniffing and doing object and feature detection in your code, and just kind of like doing things the right way. It's not just the right way, though. It's also just the smart and cost-effective way. I should make a small note here that shorter development time, you may not see that like right away when you start doing this, but once you get more familiar with these principles and these techniques and how everything works, you'll become a lot more accustomed to the approach, and you'll become much more efficient over time. And pretty soon on, you'll be much more efficient than you were before you started doing this. So let's take a step back and look at the bigger picture. The bigger picture of the JavaScript landscape, or the Grand Canyon landscape in this case. We have all these things like Moderniser, all the cool stuff in HTML5 and CSS3, and these are all very big influences in what's transforming the JavaScript landscape, but they're also not the only things going on. I mean, we have other examples are these great frameworks that have been popping up in recent times, and by recent times I mean like the past couple of years. Two of them I want to give some particular mention here. The first is SproutCore, which has already been mentioned a couple of times at this conference. It's probably most well known for being the JavaScript framework that powers the mobile me web applications at me.com. SproutCore basically allows you to use JavaScript to build desktop-like applications in a browser. And it's gone through an enormous amount of development in the past year. And by now it's become very refined and very powerful. Similar to that is Cappuccino, the makers of which are here this weekend. I take it you all saw their talk yesterday here at JSConf. If you missed it, that's a shame. Cappuccino is very similar to SproutCore. It's basically the Objective-C runtime, and Objective-C is like the Mac applications framework, or not entirely, but it's like Objective-C runtime implemented in JavaScript. I do a poor job of explaining it, so I really hope you caught their session yesterday, because it's some seriously cool stuff that's going on in the JavaScript landscape. There's even more going on, but we're kind of starting to get way past the scope of this presentation. So all these cool new developments in the world of JavaScript, they're changing kind of my opinion on JavaScript itself. And I'm starting to hate it less and less. And maybe someday I'll not even hate it at all. Since you guys already don't hate it and probably quite like it, I mean, you're here at the JavaScript conference, I hope you use these tools, use them well, use them responsibly, and that you'll just make really exciting things and spend less time trying to polish things for Internet Explorer, because it's not really worth it. And that's kind of all I have for today, and I reckon we go get some lunch. What? Oh, really? Oh, what time is it? But it's lunchtime. Well, anyhow, nonetheless, lunch or not.